On a cold, rainy evening in the quiet town of Westford, Officer Mark Holloway was on what seemed like another routine patrol. With over 2 decades on the force, he had grown accustomed to the predictable rhythms of his small community. But fate had other plans that night. When he spotted a young girl alone at a bus stop, drenched in rain and clutching a pair of worn yellow shoes, his instincts told him something was deeply wrong. This child, barely 9 or 10 years old, was a stark picture of vulnerability, a mystery waiting to be unraveled. What began as a moment of concern quickly became a turning point in both their lives. For Holloway, the girl's haunted eyes and trembling form awakened memories of his own past, a painful chapter he thought he had buried long ago. For the girl, Lila, it was a chance to find safety and perhaps even hope in the midst of her overwhelming grief. Together, their encounter would lead to a journey of healing, connection, and the discovery of what it truly means to be a family. This is a story of loss and resilience, of unexpected bonds forged in the most unlikely of circumstances, and of how 2 broken souls found a way to help each other heal. As the rain poured down that fateful night, it washed away the silence, setting in motion a chain of events that would change their lives forever. A fateful encounter on a rainy night. The rain fell relentlessly over the small town of Westford, transforming the streets into glistening paths under the dim glow of the streetlights. It was the kind of rain that made people retreat to the comfort of their homes, leaving the roads eerily quiet. Officer Mark Holloway had seen countless nights like this during his 2 decades on the force. His patrols were typically uneventful, a predictable routine of circling the same streets and ensuring all was calm in this suburban town. But on this particular evening, fate had something different in store. As the wipers of his patrol car struggled against the heavy downpour, Holloway scanned the streets out of habit. Years of experience had sharpened his instincts, and even the slightest anomaly would catch his attention. Driving down Ashmore Street, which was usually bustling with life during the day, he noticed an unusual sight. A small figure was huddled on the bench of a desolate bus stop. The sight was startling, a stark contrast to the empty, rain-soaked surroundings. He slowed the car, narrowing his eyes to focus through the misty windshield. Holloway pulled the patrol car to the curb and turned off the engine, leaving only the rhythmic sound of the rain hitting the roof. He sat for a moment, observing the figure. It was a child, a girl no older than 9 or 10. Her small frame was curled up, knees drawn to her chest, and she seemed oblivious to the cold rain soaking her pink dress. The vibrant yellow shoes she clutched stood out against the greyness of the scene, their brightness dulled by scuffs and wear. Something stirred deep within Holloway, a mix of concern and an instinctive protective urge. This wasn't just a routine check, there was something profoundly wrong about this picture. Children didn't sit alone at bus stops on stormy nights, and certainly not like this, soaked, trembling, and clutching a pair of shoes as though her life depended on them. He couldn't ignore the unease gnawing at him. Before stepping out of the car, Holloway radioed in his location, ensuring dispatch knew where he was. The last thing he wanted was for this situation to escalate without backup nearby, though he hoped it wouldn't come to that. Grabbing his flashlight, he exited the car and approached the bus stop cautiously. The cold rain immediately soaked through his uniform, but Holloway barely noticed. His focus was entirely on the girl. As he got closer, he could see her face, pale, streaked with raindrops and tears. Her hair was a tangled mess, plastered to her skin, and her eyes were fixed on the ground, unseeing and distant. The yellow shoes in her hands were pressed tightly against her chest, as if they were the only thing anchoring her to reality. "Hey there," Holloway said gently, his voice barely rising above the sound of the rain. He stopped a few feet away, not wanting to startle her. "My name's Officer Holloway. Are you okay? Do you need help?" The girl didn't respond. Her small frame remained frozen, her eyes refusing to meet his. Holloway crouched slightly, trying to make himself appear less intimidating. Years of experience had taught him how to approach delicate situations like this, but this one felt different. The vulnerability in her posture and the haunted look in her eyes reminded him of someone he had lost long ago. He tried again. "It's pretty wet out here. How about we get you somewhere warm and dry? I promise, I'm here to help." Still, there was no response. The girl's grip on the shoes seemed to tighten, her knuckles turning white. Holloway felt a pang of helplessness, a rare sensation for a seasoned officer. He noticed that her pink dress was torn and dirty, as though she had been running through the streets. Her feet were bare, her skin reddened from the cold. As he knelt in front of her, trying to make eye contact, a vivid memory surged to the forefront of his mind. It was the night he lost everything, his wife and daughter taken from him in a house fire while he was on duty. The guilt, the anguish, and the haunting question of what might have been if he had been there instead of on patrol had never left him. Now, looking at this little girl, he felt that same ache in his chest. She wasn't Emma, but the pain in her eyes mirrored his own. She was a child lost in a storm, just as he had been lost in his grief all those years ago. Shaking off the painful memory, Holloway focused on the present. The girl needed his help, and he couldn't let his emotions cloud his judgment. He reached out slowly, intending to offer her his hand, but stopped himself when he saw her flinch. She was terrified, and any sudden move might make her retreat further into herself. "It's okay," he said softly, lowering his voice to a soothing tone. "You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you." For a brief moment, the girl's eyes flickered upward, meeting his. It was only a second, but it was enough for Holloway to see the depth of her fear, and something else. Pain. Loss. It was as if she had the weight of the world on her small shoulders. Minutes felt like hours as Holloway waited for her to respond. Occasionally, he glanced down the empty street, expecting a frantic parent or guardian to appear. But the road remained silent, the rain relentless. Finally, he made a decision. He couldn't leave her there, and he couldn't wait any longer. He would have to act, carefully but decisively. "I've got a warm car just over there," he said, pointing back toward his patrol vehicle. "We can sit inside, dry off, and figure things out. How does that sound?" This time, there was the faintest nod from the girl. Holloway felt a small surge of relief. He rose slowly, extending a hand to her. "Take your time," he said gently. "There's no rush." The girl hesitated before finally placing her small, trembling hand in his. It was cold as ice. Holloway helped her to her feet, shielding her as best he could from the rain with his coat. As they walked toward the patrol car, her steps were unsteady, her grip on the yellow shoes never loosening. Holloway opened the passenger door, carefully helping her inside before wrapping a blanket around her small frame. As he settled into the driver's seat, Holloway glanced at the girl beside him. She still hadn't spoken, but she was no longer completely closed off. The journey to uncover her story, and to help her heal, had begun. The initial connection. The rain continued its relentless patter against the windows of Officer Mark Holloway's patrol car. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy with silence. The little girl, whom he had gently guided out of the cold, sat in the passenger seat, her tiny frame wrapped in a blanket. She stared straight ahead, her fingers clutching the yellow shoes as though they were a lifeline. Her wet hair clung to her face, and her expression remained distant, unreadable. Holloway adjusted the heater, hoping the warm air would bring some comfort. He stole a glance at her, his mind racing with questions. Who was she? Why was she out here alone on such a stormy night? And, perhaps most pressing, what kind of pain had left her in this fragile state? He knew better than to push her to speak. Trauma often required time and patience, but he needed answers. Without knowing her story, he couldn't help her. "I'm glad you got out of the rain," he said softly, breaking the silence. "It's a nasty night to be outside." There was no response. The girl's eyes remained fixed on the dashboard, her fingers tightening around the shoes. They were a bright yellow, clearly once loved but now worn and scuffed, as if they had seen better days. They seemed too large to belong to her. Holloway's heart ached as he wondered about their significance. "I'm Mark," he continued gently, his voice steady and calm. "But you can call me Officer Holloway if that feels better. What's your name?" Still, she said nothing. The silence was thick, but Holloway didn't let it deter him. He knew she needed to feel safe, and rushing her wouldn't help. Instead, he focused on making her as comfortable as possible. He reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a small pack of tissues, offering it to her. She hesitated, glancing at him briefly before taking them with a barely perceptible nod. "There you go," he said with a small smile. "Take your time. We're not in any rush." As she dabbed at her rain-streaked face, Holloway's thoughts drifted back to his own daughter, Emma. He could almost see her sitting in that same seat, laughing and chattering away about her school day. The memory was bittersweet, a sharp reminder of what he had lost. But tonight wasn't about him. It was about this little girl, and whatever pain she was carrying. Minutes passed in silence, broken only by the hum of the car heater. Holloway glanced at the yellow shoes again, their vibrant color standing out against the gray of the night. "Those are nice shoes," he said, his tone casual. "Are they yours?" For the first time, the girl's gaze shifted slightly, her eyes flickering to the shoes in her lap. She didn't speak, but Holloway noticed a change in her posture, an almost imperceptible hunch of her shoulders, as though she were protecting the shoes from an unseen threat. It was clear that they meant something deeply personal to her. They look important, Holloway continued, his voice kind and reassuring. Were they a gift? Her fingers tightened around the shoes, and for a moment, Holloway thought she might speak. But instead, a single tear rolled down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away with the tissue, her movements quick and defensive. Holloway's chest tightened at the sight. Whatever her story was, it was clear that the shoes were more than just an item. They were a symbol of something she wasn't ready to let go of. You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to, Holloway said softly. But I'm here to listen if you're ready. The girl remained silent, but Holloway didn't mind. He knew trust wasn't built in an instant, especially not for a child who seemed so profoundly hurt. He decided to focus on the immediate next steps, getting her somewhere safe and warm, where she could begin to feel secure. Holloway reached for the radio, hesitating for a moment. Reporting this to dispatch would mean bringing in other officers, possibly sirens and questions, things that could overwhelm her. But it was his duty, and he needed to ensure she received the right care. Dispatch, this is Officer Holloway, he said into the radio, his voice steady but low. I've got a young girl with me, approximately 9 or 10 years old. Found her alone at the bus stop on Ashmore Street. Requesting guidance on next steps. The crackle of the radio filled the car as he waited for a response. The girl flinched at the noise, her body tensing. Holloway quickly turned down the volume, offering her a reassuring glance. Sorry about that, he said gently. I just need to make sure we do this the right way. Dispatch responded, instructing him to bring the child to the station where a social worker could be contacted. Holloway acknowledged the instructions but hesitated before starting the car. He looked over at the girl, who had retreated back into her silence. We're going to take a short drive, he said, his tone calm and comforting. There's a warm, safe place where we can figure out what's next. Does that sound okay? This time, there was the faintest nod from her. Holloway's relief was tempered by the realization that this was only the beginning. Whatever had led this child to that lonely bus stop in the rain was far from resolved. But as he pulled onto the road, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had let him guide her this far, and that was a start. As the patrol car moved through the quiet streets, Holloway couldn't shake the image of her clutching those yellow shoes. They were a mystery, just like the girl herself. But one thing was clear, they were the key to understanding her story, and he was determined to unlock it, one careful step at a time. Unraveling the mystery. The patrol car pulled into the parking lot of the Westford police station, its headlights cutting through the misty rain. Officer Mark Holloway glanced at the girl sitting in the passenger seat, her small frame wrapped tightly in the blanket he had given her. She hadn't said a word during the drive, her focus fixed entirely on the yellow shoes resting in her lap. Holloway's concern deepened with every passing moment. Who was this child, and what could have driven her to such a state? The station was quiet, the usual buzz of activity subdued by the late hour. Holloway parked the car and turned to the girl, his tone gentle. We're here. Let's get you inside where it's warm, okay? She hesitated, her wide eyes darting toward the unfamiliar building. Holloway noticed her grip on the shoes tighten again, a reflex that seemed to comfort her in moments of stress. He gave her a reassuring smile. It's okay. You're safe here. I promise. Slowly, she nodded, allowing him to guide her out of the car. He kept his movements deliberate and calm, making sure not to overwhelm her. As they entered the station, Holloway could feel the eyes of his colleagues on them. He waved off their unspoken questions, knowing he'd have to explain everything later. For now, his priority was the frightened child at his side. He led her to one of the smaller, quieter interview rooms, a space designed for situations like this, with soft lighting and comfortable furniture meant to put people at ease. Holloway pulled out a chair for her, but she chose to sit on the small couch in the corner, curling up with her knees to her chest. The yellow shoes never left her grasp. I'll be right back, Holloway said, his voice kind but firm. I'm going to get you some hot chocolate. How does that sound? For the first time, her eyes flickered with something other than fear. She gave the faintest nod, and Holloway took that as a victory. He stepped out of the room, leaving the door slightly ajar so she wouldn't feel trapped. In the hallway, he ran into Maria Rodriguez, one of his fellow officers. Mark, Maria said, her brow furrowed with concern. What's going on? Who's the girl? Holloway gave her a quick rundown of the situation, keeping his voice low. She's not talking yet, but it's clear she's been through something traumatic. I'm about to call in a social worker, but I was hoping you could sit with her while I make the arrangements. I think having a friendly face might help. Maria nodded immediately. Of course. Poor thing must be terrified. Holloway made his way to the break room, where he prepared 2 mugs of hot chocolate, adding extra marshmallows to one. He couldn't help but think about the yellow shoes again. They seemed like such an odd detail, yet they clearly held immense significance for the girl. What story did they tell? Who had they belonged to? As he carried the mugs back to the room, he resolved to find out. When he returned, he found Maria sitting beside the girl, speaking softly. The girl's body language had relaxed slightly, though she still clung to the shoes. Holloway handed her the hot chocolate, crouching to her level as he placed it on the small table in front of her. "Careful," he said with a smile. "It's hot, but I think you'll like it. And I hope you don't mind marshmallows. I might have gone overboard." A ghost of a smile crossed her face as she reached for the mug. Holloway felt a surge of hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "Can I sit here?" he asked, gesturing to the chair across from her. She hesitated, then nodded. Holloway sat down, keeping his posture relaxed. Maria excused herself, giving them space. Holloway decided to try again. "I know this is all new and probably a little scary," he said gently. "But I want to help you. Can you tell me your name?" She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the shoes in her lap. Holloway waited, giving her time to process. Finally, in a voice so soft he almost missed it, she whispered, "Lila." "Lila," Holloway repeated, his tone warm. "That's a beautiful name. It's nice to meet you, Lila." Lila didn't respond, but her shoulders seemed to relax just a fraction. Encouraged, Holloway pressed on. "Do you want to tell me about those shoes? They seem really special to you." Her eyes welled with tears, and she hugged the shoes closer. "They were my mom's," she said, her voice trembling. "They're all I have left of her." The weight of her words hit Holloway like a punch to the gut. He could see the depth of her grief in her tear-filled eyes, a pain far too heavy for a child to bear alone. "I'm so sorry, Lila," he said softly. "Your mom must have been really special." Lila nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "She was. She used to dance in these shoes. She said they made her feel free." Holloway's heart ached as he listened. The shoes weren't just an item, they were a connection to a life and a love Lila had lost. He thought of his own daughter, Emma, and the way her favorite pink sneakers had sat untouched in the corner of her room for months after the fire. He understood the need to hold on, to preserve what little was left of someone you loved. "Lila," he said gently, "I want you to know it's okay to miss your mom. It's okay to hold on to the things that remind you of her. No one's going to take that away from you." Her sobs quieted slightly, though the tears continued to fall. Holloway waited, giving her space to feel her emotions. When she finally spoke again, her voice was barely audible. "I ran away because they wanted me to forget her. They said I needed to let go, but I can't. I don't want to." Holloway's protective instincts flared. Whoever they were, likely the orphanage she had come from, they clearly hadn't understood the depth of Lila's grief. It wasn't about letting go, it was about learning to live with the loss. He knew he had to advocate for her, to ensure she was given the support and understanding she so desperately needed. "I understand, Lila," he said firmly. "And I'm going to do everything I can to help you. You're not alone anymore." For the first time, Lila looked at him fully, her tear-streaked face filled with a mix of hope and hesitation. "You promise?" she asked. "I promise," Holloway said, his voice steady. "We'll figure this out together." In that moment, the mystery of Lila's yellow shoes began to unravel, revealing not just a story of loss but also a path forward. For both of them, this was only the beginning. A shared pain. The soft glow of the station's warm lights cast a sense of calm over the small interview room where Lila sat, still clutching her mother's yellow shoes. Officer Mark Holloway watched her quietly, his heart heavy with a mixture of emotions. The girl's story was slowly beginning to unfold, a tale of profound loss and an unyielding grip on the only tangible memory of her mother. It wasn't just her story that weighed on him, though. It was a stark resemblance to his own past, to the pain he had carried for years, that made it impossible for him to remain detached. Holloway leaned back in his chair, his thoughts drifting to the night his life changed forever. It had been a routine patrol, just like any other night. He was out in the field, ensuring the safety of the streets, while his wife and daughter, Emma, were at home. He remembered the call he received from dispatch, the urgent tone that cut through the monotony of the night. A house fire. He didn't realize it was his house until he arrived on the scene, flames engulfing everything he had built, everything he had loved. The loss was a wound that never fully healed. The memories of Emma's laughter and his wife's gentle presence haunted him, especially on quiet nights like this. He had buried himself in work, using his duty as an officer to shield himself from the crushing grief that threatened to consume him. But the pain lingered, always just beneath the surface. Now, as he looked at Lila, he saw echoes of himself in her. The way she clung to the yellow shoes reminded him of how he had held onto Emma's pink sneakers long after her passing. They had sat untouched in the corner of her room, a painful but necessary reminder of the life that was taken too soon. He knew the weight of those shoes all too well, how they could feel like an anchor to the past and a barrier to moving forward. Holloway cleared his throat, breaking the silence in the room. Lila's gaze shifted to him, wary but attentive. "Lila," he began softly, "I know what it's like to lose someone you love." Her eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. He could see the question forming in her mind, though she didn't voice it. "I had a daughter," Holloway continued, his voice steady despite the lump forming in his throat. "Her name was Emma. She was about your age, full of energy, always keeping me on my toes." He smiled faintly at the memory, though it was tinged with sadness. "But one night, there was an accident. A fire. I lost her and my wife that night." Lila's expression softened, her wariness giving way to something else, recognition, perhaps, or understanding. She didn't say anything, but her body language shifted. She uncrossed her arms slightly, her grip on the shoes loosening just a bit. "It's hard," Holloway admitted. "Really hard. There were days when I didn't think I could keep going. But I want you to know something, Lila. It's okay to feel sad. It's okay to miss your mom. And it's okay to hold on to the things that remind you of her." Tears welled up in Lila's eyes as she listened, her small frame trembling with the effort to hold them back. "They don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They tell me to forget her, to let go of the shoes. But I can't. I won't." Holloway leaned forward, his voice firm but kind. "You don't have to forget her. No one has the right to tell you how to grieve. Those shoes are special because they remind you of her, and that's okay. Grief doesn't mean letting go. It means finding a way to keep their memory alive while still moving forward." Lila looked down at the shoes in her lap, her fingers tracing the worn leather. "She loved these shoes," she said quietly. "She used to dance in them, spinning around the living room. She said they made her feel like she could fly." Holloway smiled softly, picturing the scene she described. "She sounds like she was an amazing person." "She was," Lila said, her voice cracking with emotion. Tears began to flow freely now, and she made no effort to hide them. "I just miss her so much." Holloway reached out, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I know you do. And it's okay to miss her. It's okay to cry and to feel sad. But you don't have to go through this alone anymore." Lila looked up at him, her tear-streaked face filled with a mixture of vulnerability and hope. "Do you miss them? Your wife and daughter?" "Every single day," Holloway admitted. "But you know what? Even though they're not here, I carry them with me, in my memories, in my heart. And that's what your mom is for you. She'll always be with you, Lila, as long as you remember her." The room fell silent again, but this time it was a comforting silence. Lila's tears gradually subsided, and though her expression was still heavy with grief, there was a hint of relief as well. For the first time, she felt like someone truly understood her pain, like she wasn't completely alone in her loss. Holloway sat back, giving her space to process everything. He knew they had a long road ahead, but this moment felt like a breakthrough. Lila had begun to open up, and in doing so, she had taken the first step toward healing. "Lila," he said after a while, "how about we take this one step at a time? We don't have to figure everything out tonight. But I promise you this, I'm going to do everything I can to help you. You're not alone in this anymore." She nodded slowly, her fingers still resting on the yellow shoes. For the first time since he found her, Holloway saw a flicker of trust in her eyes. It wasn't much, but it was enough. As they sat together in the quiet room, two souls connected by their shared pain, Holloway felt a renewed sense of purpose. Helping Lila heal wasn't just about her, it was also a chance for him to find healing in his own life. Together, they would face the challenges ahead, one step at a time. Challenging the system. Officer Mark Holloway sat at his desk in the quiet corner of the police station, his fingers drumming absently against the surface as he contemplated his next move. Across from him sat Lila, the young girl he had found at the bus stop, now wrapped in a blanket and sipping on hot chocolate. She looked calmer, but her eyes still betrayed a sense of vulnerability and unease. Holloway couldn't stop thinking about what she had shared with him, the yellow shoes, her mother, and the devastating sense of loss that had led her to run away from the orphanage. The logical next step was clear: follow protocol. Lila needed to be returned to Everbright Orphanage, where she was listed as a runaway. But the thought of doing so filled Holloway with unease. He had seen firsthand how the system could fail children like Lila, treating them as numbers on a spreadsheet rather than individuals with unique needs. The orphanage staff might be well-meaning, but they didn't understand the depth of Lila's grief. They had asked her to give up her mother's shoes, the last tangible connection to the woman who had meant everything to her. How could he send her back to a place where her pain wasn't acknowledged, let alone addressed? Holloway leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. This wasn't the first time he had been faced with a situation that demanded he weigh his duty against his conscience. As a police officer, he was bound by rules and regulations, but as a human being, he felt a moral obligation to protect this child in a way that the system couldn't. "Lila," he said softly, breaking the silence. She looked up at him, her fingers tightening around the yellow shoes. "How do you feel about going back to the orphanage?" Her reaction was immediate. Fear flashed across her face, and she shook her head vigorously. "I don't want to go back," she whispered. "They don't understand. They want me to forget her." Holloway's heart sank. He had expected resistance, but hearing the desperation in her voice solidified his resolve. He couldn't let her return to a place where her grief was dismissed. But what were his options? The system wasn't built for exceptions, and he would need to find a way to work within its confines while still advocating for Lila. Taking a deep breath, Holloway reached for his phone and dialed the number for Everbright Orphanage. The call was answered on the second ring by a woman with a brisk, no-nonsense tone. "This is Mrs. Blackwood, Director of Everbright Orphanage," she said. "How can I help you?" "Mrs. Blackwood, this is Officer Mark Holloway with the Westford Police Department," he began. "I'm calling about a child in your care, Lila Thompson. She was found earlier tonight at a bus stop in town." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before Mrs. Blackwood responded. "Oh, thank goodness," she said, relief evident in her voice. "We've been worried sick about her. She ran away this afternoon, and we've been trying to locate her ever since." "Is she safe?" "She's safe," Holloway confirmed. "But I need to discuss a few concerns before I arrange to bring her back." "Concerns?" Mrs. Blackwood repeated, her tone shifting to one of curiosity. "Yes," Holloway said, choosing his words carefully. "Lila is clearly struggling with significant grief related to the loss of her mother. She's expressed that the staff at the orphanage have asked her to give up personal items that remind her of her mother, including a pair of yellow shoes that she holds very dear. I understand the challenges of running an orphanage, but I'm concerned that this approach may be exacerbating her emotional distress." There was a moment of silence before Mrs. Blackwood responded, her tone defensive. "Officer Holloway, we do our best to create a supportive environment for all of our children. However, we also have to maintain order and ensure that each child adapts to life here. Lila's attachment to those shoes has been preventing her from fully engaging with the other children and moving forward. Sometimes, letting go is necessary for healing." "With all due respect, Mrs. Blackwood," Holloway said, his voice firm but polite, "letting go isn't something that can be forced. Grief is a deeply personal process, and for Lila, those shoes represent her connection to her mother. Taking them away or pressuring her to move on before she's ready could do more harm than good." There was another pause, and when Mrs. Blackwood spoke again, her tone was measured. "I understand your concerns, officer, but we have protocols in place for a reason. Lila's well-being is our priority, and we'll address her needs as best we can once she's returned to us." Holloway clenched his jaw, feeling a surge of frustration. It was clear that Mrs. Blackwood didn't fully grasp the depth of Lila's pain or the importance of those yellow shoes. He knew he couldn't change her mind over the phone, but he also couldn't let this be the end of the conversation. "I'll bring her back in the morning," Holloway said finally, his tone calm but resolute. "But I would like to meet with you in person to discuss her care plan. It's important to me that we find a way to support her emotional needs rather than dismissing them." "Very well," Mrs. Blackwood said, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "I'll expect you at 10 a.m. sharp." Holloway ended the call and leaned back in his chair, letting out a slow breath. He knew this was only the first step in what would likely be a long and difficult process. The system was rigid, and changing minds would require patience and persistence. But as he looked at Lila, who had fallen asleep on the couch with the yellow shoes cradled in her arms, he felt a renewed sense of determination. She had already been through so much, and he wasn't going to let her face this alone. If the system wasn't willing to bend for her, then he would find another way. For Lila's sake, he had to. An unconventional decision. As the morning sun began to filter through the windows of the police station, Officer Mark Holloway sat quietly in the corner of the interview room. He had spent the night watching over Lila, ensuring she felt safe in the unfamiliar surroundings. The girl was still curled up on the couch, clutching her mother's yellow shoes as if they were a lifeline. Her small frame rose and fell with each slow breath, and for a moment she seemed at peace. Holloway, however, felt far from it. The conversation with Mrs. Blackwood the night before had left him deeply unsettled. The rigid protocols of the orphanage didn't account for the emotional complexities of a grieving child like Lila. Sending her back felt like a betrayal, like abandoning her to a system that didn't understand her pain. Holloway's instincts as a father, a role he hadn't played in years, began to take over. He couldn't shake the image of Lila's tear-streaked face as she begged not to return. She needed more than a roof over her head. She needed someone who would listen, someone who would care. As the minutes ticked by, Holloway wrestled with an idea that had been forming in the back of his mind since the moment he found her. It was unconventional, to say the least, and it went against every rule in the book. But the more he thought about it, the more it felt like the only option. He glanced at Lila again, her small hands still gripping the shoes even in sleep, and his resolve hardened. He stood quietly, careful not to wake her, and stepped into the hallway. His colleague, Officer Maria Rodriguez, was waiting just outside, her expression a mix of curiosity and concern. She had been briefed on Lila's situation and had stayed late to offer her support. "Mark," Maria said softly, "how's she doing?" "She's sleeping," Holloway replied, his voice low. "For now, at least." Maria studied him for a moment, sensing the tension in his demeanor. "You're thinking about doing something, aren't you? Something outside the box." Holloway leaned against the wall, crossing his arms as he let out a heavy sigh. "She's been through so much, Maria. Sending her back to that orphanage doesn't feel right. They're not equipped to handle what she's dealing with. And those shoes are everything to her. They're asking her to let go of the one thing that connects her to her mother. I can't let that happen." Maria nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "What are you planning?" Holloway hesitated, knowing how unconventional his idea sounded. "I'm thinking about applying to become her foster parent." Maria's eyes widened in surprise. "Mark, that's a huge step. Are you sure? I mean, fostering a child, especially one with Lila's trauma, is a big responsibility." "I know," Holloway admitted. "And I know it won't be easy. But I can't just stand by and let her get lost in the system. She needs someone who understands what she's going through, someone who can give her the time and space to heal. I've been where she is, Maria. I know what it feels like to lose everything." Maria's expression softened as she saw the sincerity in his eyes. "You really care about her, don't you?" "I do," Holloway said firmly. "I didn't think I'd ever feel this way again, but she reminds me of Emma. I can't explain it, but I feel like this is what I'm supposed to do." Maria placed a hand on his shoulder, offering a small smile. "Well, you've got my support, for what it's worth. But you know this isn't going to be easy. The process is long, and there's no guarantee you'll be approved." "I know," Holloway said, his resolve unwavering. "But I have to try." The next step was to contact the necessary authorities and begin the application process. Holloway knew the road ahead would be filled with challenges. He would need to undergo background checks, home inspections, and a series of interviews to prove he was capable of providing a stable and nurturing environment for Lila. The system didn't make it easy for single applicants, especially those with demanding jobs like his, but Holloway was determined. When Lila woke up later that morning, Holloway sat down beside her, his tone gentle but serious. "Lila," he began, "I've been thinking a lot about how I can help you. And I want to ask you something. How would you feel about coming to live with me? Not right away, it would take some time to make it happen. But it's something I want to try." Lila's eyes widened, a mixture of shock and cautious hope crossing her face. "You mean, you'd be my dad?" Holloway smiled softly. "Well, officially, I'd be your foster dad. But if it works out, maybe one day it could be something more permanent. Only if that's what you want." Tears filled Lila's eyes, and for a moment, Holloway worried he had overwhelmed her. But then she nodded, a small, hopeful smile forming on her lips. "I'd like that," she whispered. "I'd like that a lot." Holloway felt a lump in his throat as he reached out to gently place a hand on her shoulder. "Then we'll make it happen," he said firmly. It won't be easy, and it might take some time, but we'll get there. Together. The rest of the day was a flurry of activity. Holloway made calls to social services, filled out preliminary paperwork, and began gathering the documents he would need for his application. Every step brought a mix of excitement and apprehension. He knew there were no guarantees, but the thought of giving Lila a stable, loving home kept him moving forward. As they left the station that evening, Lila held onto her yellow shoes, a new light in her eyes. For the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that she might finally have a place to belong. Holloway felt it too. For the first time since losing his family, he had found a new purpose, a reason to move forward. They were stepping into uncharted territory, but they would face it together. One step at a time. The day Lila officially moved into Officer Mark Holloway's home was marked by a quiet sense of joy and nervous anticipation. After weeks of navigating the rigorous foster care process, background checks, home inspections, and interviews, the moment had finally arrived. Holloway stood by his front door, watching as Lila stepped inside with a small suitcase in one hand and her yellow shoes carefully tucked under her arm. "Welcome home, kiddo," he said softly, his voice warm. Lila glanced around, her eyes wide as she took in the cozy space. The walls were painted in soft, calming colors, and the room exuded a warmth that contrasted sharply with the institutional feel of the orphanage. Holloway had spent countless hours preparing for this day, transforming his spare bedroom into a space that was uniquely hers. The walls were painted a soft yellow, a nod to the shoes she cherished, and the shelves were already filled with books and trinkets he thought she might like. Is this really mine?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every bit of it," Holloway replied, smiling. "You can make it your own however you'd like. This is your home now." Tears welled in Lila's eyes as she set down her suitcase and the shoes, taking a tentative step forward. Holloway watched as she moved through the house, her fingers brushing over the furniture and decorations as if trying to convince herself it was real. In the days and weeks that followed, they began to settle into a routine. There were moments of adjustment, of course. Lila had grown used to being independent and wary of adults, and Holloway had to learn how to be patient as she navigated her new environment. There were nights when the nightmares returned, and Lila would wake up crying for her mother. Holloway would sit with her, his presence a quiet reassurance that she wasn't alone anymore. On other days, they found moments of joy that made the hard times worth it. Lila quickly discovered that Holloway was terrible at telling jokes, but she laughed at them anyway, finding comfort in his earnest attempts to make her smile. Holloway, in turn, marveled at her resilience and her growing confidence as she began to open up about her dreams and interests. One evening, as they were sitting together in the living room, Lila pulled out her mother's yellow shoes and placed them on the coffee table. I want to keep these somewhere special," she said, her voice hesitant. "Not hidden, but safe." Holloway nodded, understanding the significance of her decision. Together, they found a spot on the bookshelf in her room, placing the shoes in a place of honor where she could see them every day. "Your mom would be proud of you," Holloway said, his voice filled with quiet emotion. "You're strong, Lila. And it's okay to carry her with you, in your heart and in your memories." Lila looked up at him, her eyes shining. "Thank you, Dad," she said, the word still new but carrying so much meaning. Holloway felt his chest tighten with emotion. Hearing her call him Dad was a gift he hadn't dared to hope for. "You're welcome, sweetheart," he replied, his voice thick. "I'm the lucky one." The months turned into a year, and their bond deepened. Lila started attending school, making friends, and thriving in ways Holloway hadn't imagined possible. She joined a dance class, inspired by the stories of her mother's love for dancing, and Holloway made it a point to be there for every recital, cheering her on from the front row. One evening, as they were sharing dinner, Lila looked across the table at Holloway, her expression serious. "Do you think we could make it official?" she asked. Holloway paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. "Make what official, Lila?" "You being my dad," she said, her voice steady. "Like, forever." Holloway felt a lump form in his throat as he set down his fork. "Lila," he said gently, "nothing would make me happier." The adoption process took months, filled with more paperwork and meetings, but Holloway tackled it with the same determination he had shown since the night he found her. The day the adoption was finalized was bright and clear, and as the judge signed the papers, Lila's face lit up with a smile that Holloway knew he would remember for the rest of his life. After the hearing, they stopped at a park to celebrate. Lila brought along her yellow shoes, now a cherished symbol of her journey. As they sat under a tree, she placed the shoes beside her and turned to Holloway. "I think she'd be happy," she said softly. Mom, I think she'd be okay with this. Holloway wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. I think she'd be more than happy, Lila. She'd be proud of you, of the amazing person you are. As the sun set over the park, casting a golden glow over the two of them, Lila leaned her head against Holloway's shoulder. For the first time in a long time, she felt truly at peace. And for Holloway, who had once thought his life would be defined by loss, this moment marked the beginning of something new, a life filled with love, hope, and the unbreakable bond they had built together. Together, they walked home hand in hand, ready to face whatever the future might bring. They were a family now, and nothing could change that.